Well, today we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have been called the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century, and actually they're probably the most important archaeological discovery of all time. Now, there were several discoveries that preceded this that we have records of. The Church Father Origen, in about 185 to 254 AD, said that the Greek version of Psalms in his Hexapla, which was his 6-column Greek Bible, was found in a jar near Jericho. Eusebius, in his Ecclesiastical History, which is probably about the same incident, says a Greek version of Psalms and other Greek and Hebrew manuscripts had been found in a jar near Jericho during the reign of the Emperor Caracalla between 211 to 217 AD. In approximately 800 AD, Timotheus I, the Nestorian patriarch of Seleucia, wrote a letter to the metropolitan or archbishop of the Syrian church, Sergius, that some books were found 10 years ago. An Arab was hunting game and his dog went in a cave. Its owner went in and found a chamber filled with books. He went to Jerusalem, and Jews came out in great numbers and found books of the Old Testament and others in Hebrew script, including more than 200 Psalms of David. Now, all of these manuscripts have disappeared. Some Jewish and Arabic sources refer to a medieval Jewish group called the Cave People, Magaria in Arabic. In 1896, Jewish scholar Solomon Schechter of Cambridge University retrieved a huge number of manuscripts from the Cairo Geniza, a Karaite synagogue room in Old Cairo that had been sealed up and forgotten in 1100 AD. These manuscripts were from as early as the 6th century AD. Most of these manuscripts remain unpublished. One manuscript in particular caught Schechter's attention. Schechter published this in 1910 under the name Fragments of a Zadokite Work, and it immediately caused a firestorm. Schechter thought it was an early Pharisaic document written in the 1st century, although his copy was from the 11th century. It was actually from the 1st century BC. We know it today as the Qumran Damascus document. It was a medieval copy of a real Dead Sea Scroll. Several explorers and archaeologists previously visited the site of Qumran. None of them found anything worth mentioning. This takes us to sometime in November or December of 1946. 3 members of the Ta'amire tribe of Bedouin, Juma Muhammad Khalil and 2 cousins, Khalil Musa and Muhammad Ahmed El Hamed, nicknamed Edhib, the Wolf, were watering their flocks at Ain Feshka, which was within walking distance of Qumran. Juma liked to explore caves looking for gold, so he would check the cliffs for caves when he could. He found a cave with 2 openings. He threw a rock into the smaller lower opening and heard the sound of an earthenware jar shatter inside. It was too dark to attempt an entrance, and they had to water their flocks the next day. Juma told his cousins about the caves, and they agreed to investigate it 2 days later. However, it was the youngest of the cousins, Muhammad Ahmed El Hamed, the Wolf, who returned to the cave several days later. Muhammad woke early and left while his companions were sleeping. Muhammad climbed into the cave through the larger opening, which was the upper opening, and inside Muhammad found 10 jars. 8 jars were empty. 1 jar was filled with dirt. Inside the last jar were 2 bundles wrapped in cloth and a 3rd bundle which was unwrapped. These were the Habakkuk commentary, the community rule, and the unwrapped one was the great Isaiah scroll. The three cousins then brought the scrolls to a Ta'amire site southeast of Bethlehem and put them in a bag which was left hanging for weeks on a tent pole. The cover broke off the Isaiah scroll, and the community rule was broken in two. In March 1947, Juma took the scrolls to an antiquities dealer who thought they were stolen from a synagogue and said they had no archaeological worth. Undeterred, Juma took them to another Bethlehem antiquities dealer named Khalil Eskandar Shahin, known as Kando, who put up a guarantee of $16 while a member of the Syrian Orthodox Church tried to sell the scrolls. So in April of 1947, this member of the Syrian Church and Kando brought the community rule to St. Mark's Syrian Monastery. The Metropolitan or Archbishop Mar Athanasius Yeshua Samuel expressed interest in buying the scrolls. In the meantime, 2 other visits were made to the cave and 4 scrolls removed. Kando kept the Genesis Apocryphon. In June, the other 3 scrolls were sold to another antiquities dealer, Faidi Salahi, for $28. In July, the Isaiah scroll, the community rule, and the commentary on Habakkuk were bought by the Metropolitan Samuel. The Bedouin ultimately made about $100 from the scrolls. Another antiquities dealer, Nasri Ohan, contacted Eleazar Sukenik of the Hebrew University and showed Sukenik part of a manuscript through a fence. Sukenik immediately recognized the antiquity of the scrolls. On November 29, Sukenik took a bus to Bethlehem and took 2 scrolls with him from Salahi to examine. Then the UN voted to form a Jewish and Palestinian state. War was imminent. In February 1948, Sukenik met with an agent of Mar Samuel and offered to buy Samuel's scrolls for $4,000.
Wow.
Instead, Mar Samuel went to the American Schools of Oriental Research. John Trevor, a photographer, compared the scrolls with orthographic plates he had. The Syrians wanted to find out what the scrolls were worth so they could sell them for more money. Trevor photographed the scrolls and said the scrolls were written around the time of the Nash Papyrus, around 200 BC. But Trevor said their value could not be determined until scholars examined them. In April of 1948, Miller Burroughs and John Trevor published a press release about the scrolls. The American version, as published, erroneously said that the scrolls were found in a Syrian monastery. This was the first time the world ever heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls. At this time, no one knew what the scrolls were, or who wrote them, or what they were worth, although Sukenik had already guessed that they were Essene. In January 1949, the Jordanian military found the cave. From February into March 1949, the cave was excavated by the Jordanian Antiquities Authority, the École Biblique, and the Palestine Archaeological Museum, led by Roland DeVoe and Lancaster Harding. In February 1952, the Bedouin found another cave. An expedition was undertaken to find all the caves in the area. The archaeologists found Cave 3, which contained the copper scroll. This was the only cave the scholars found. In August 1952, the Bedouin found manuscripts at Nahal Hever, Kirbet Murd, and Wadi Marabaat, which were other sites. These were all brought together with the Qumran scrolls to the scholars. DeVoe decided to excavate Qumran because it was near the caves. A Bedouin said that when he was young, he chased a partridge into a cave. This was Cave 4, with over 15,000 fragments of scrolls. Eventually, by 1955, 11 caves were found. Cave 11 contained the Psalm Scroll and the Temple Scroll, but nothing was found in Cave 5. The Cave 4 texts were so extensive that the scholars had trouble paying for them. When the war broke out in 1948, Athanasius Samuel went to America, and he put an ad in the Wall Street Journal selling the scrolls. Through an intermediary, Yigael Yadin, Sukenik's son, bought the scrolls for $250,000 and returned each scroll to the State of Israel on a separate plane to prevent terrorist attacks. This brings us to the publication of the scrolls. An international team undertook publication of the scrolls, funded for 6 years by John D. Rockefeller. In the 1960s, the money ran out, and publication slowed to a trickle. The members of this team were 8 Christians, mostly Catholics. A team far too small to complete the task. Also, at this time, the scholars began to add introductions, extensive footnotes, and extensive commentaries to their editions. This enhanced their scholarly reputations, but greatly delayed the publication of the scrolls. Roland DeVoe, a Catholic, had a policy that only his hand-picked team could see the unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls, and this policy was continued by his successor, John Strugnell. In 1967, after negotiations broke down, Yigael Yadin and his soldiers went to the home of Kando in Bethlehem during the Six-Day War and seized the Temple Scroll. Yadin published the Temple Scroll in 1977 in Hebrew, and an English translation appeared in 1988. Yadin also excavated Masada and the Cave of Letters in Nachal Hever. Kando was eventually paid for the Temple Scroll, but Kando never had dealings with the Israelis again. Kando hid large numbers of manuscripts in his home. Kando evidently sold the Qumran Scroll of Genesis to pay for the Temple Scroll. That scroll of Genesis is now in a bank vault in Germany, for sale for $60 million. Numerous Dead Sea Scrolls have appeared on the black market since then, and some have been acquired by Hobby Lobby and the Museum of the Bible, evidently through Kando's son. Recently, a 12th Qumran cave was found. Apparently, the caves have not yet all been excavated. DeVoe died without publishing his excavation report, although he did publish his Zweig lectures on the scrolls. In 1984, John Strugnell became head of the Scrolls publication team. At the first International Scrolls Conference in New York in 1984, Elisha Qimron read a paper revealing the existence of a document called 4QMMT, or the Halakhic Letter. Scholars immediately recognized the importance of this document, and an uproar broke out that such an important text had never been published. In 1989, Robert Eisenman and Philip Davies asked Strugnell for access to some unpublished documents. Strugnell refused. In 1991, Ben Zion Watchholder and Martin Abegg used a secretly circulated handwritten concordance to reconstruct all of the unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls. This was published as a preliminary edition of the unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls by the Biblical Archaeology Society. Immediately afterwards, William A. Moffat, director of the Huntington Library, announced that photographs of the scrolls in the library were available to anyone. Also in 1991, the Biblical Archaeology Review published a facsimile edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 2 volumes by Robert Eisenman and James Robinson. This included the text of 4QMMT. Now the scrolls team was put into Jewish hands under Emmanuel Tov and enlarged to 40 people. Strugnall had been removed after he called Judaism a horrible religion in a published interview in an Israeli newspaper. Some 40 volumes have been published up to about 2002. In 1992, Elisha Qimron sued Herschel Shanks, Eisenman, Robinson, and the Biblical Archaeology Society in an Israeli court for copyright infringement over 4QMMT. Qimron won. In 1994, Qimron's text of 4QMMT was published. The scripts used in the scrolls indicated that they were written between just before 200 BC to 37 AD. Carbon-14 dating confirmed these dates. This meant that the scrolls were not a hoax. Accelerator mass spectrometry indicated that the scroll jars were manufactured from clay found at Qumran. The cleanliness and purity of the vessels were important for holding scrolls, food, and liquids. In the Testament of Moses in the pseudepigrapha, Moses has Joshua hide books in earthenware jars until the end of days. But this text was not found at Qumran. So, who wrote the scrolls? In the Damascus document, it is said that the movement appeared 390 years after the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, and wandered like blind men for 20 years until the appearance of its leader, the teacher of righteousness. It said it was in exile in Damascus. These numbers are round, symbolic numbers, and the statements are in a code known only to the members of the sect. Damascus may actually be Qumran. So modern scholars have not come to an agreement on what this means. But these figures have the group arising about 197 BC and the teacher about 177 BC. They put the teacher arising just before the Maccabean revolt. In 1 Enoch 90, 28 through 33, it says, "The ancient house caught fire. The Lord of the sheep brought about a new house. All the sheep were within it." In Jubilees, it says, "In those days, after a climax of persecution, children will begin to search the law and to search the commandments and return to the way of righteousness." Jubilees 3:26. It would seem that Hellenism was the cause of the movement's origin, and they claim greater antiquity than the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans. Numerous copies of both 1 Enoch and Jubilees were found at the site, which would seem to attest to this, as well as fit the dating of the manuscripts, mostly from the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. Central to this question, of the origin of the sect, is the identity of the wicked priest who opposes the teacher of righteousness, who is assumed to be either Jonathan Maccabee about 152 BC or John Hyrcanus about 135 BC. Josephus first mentions the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees in the time of Jonathan. The Qumran texts do assume the most extreme anti-Hellenism stance of any Jewish group in antiquity. Other historical references in the scrolls place them closer to the reign of Alexander Jannaeus about 100 BC. Jody Magnus says that the main building at the site occurred about 100 BC. There are three main theories put forth as to the origin of the sect. The Essene hypothesis, which assumes a Jerusalem priestly origin for the sect. The high priesthood was apparently vacant between 159 and 152 BC, which is when Jonathan Maccabee assumed the high priesthood. The teacher of righteousness may have been serving as high priest and would have been forced out. The Groningen hypothesis assumes there were 6 different wicked priests, the last 3 of which persecuted the teacher of righteousness. Gabriele Boccaccini believed the Essenes had their origin in the Enochic movement, and the Qumran group was a breakaway group. There are no historical references in the scrolls later than the 1st century BC. The site was destroyed by the Romans as they approached Jericho in June of 68 AD. The manuscripts may have been placed in the caves in 100 BC. The Essenes were written about by Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, both Jewish authors, and pagan authors include Pliny the Elder and Dio Chrysostom in the 1st century, and a Christian author, Hegesippus, in the 2nd century. All of these authors appear to be relying on earlier written sources. Pliny says the Essenes live on the western shore of the Dead Sea between Jericho and En-Gedi, a near-perfect designation of the location of Qumran, even though Pliny had never been in Judea. Now we'll talk about the beliefs of the sect. We know that some of the scrolls are older than the sect, and we know that only part of the scrolls exhibit the ideology of the sect. Josephus says only the Essenes collected ancient books. Since Qumran is the only site that has such books, we can assume that most of these texts came from somewhere else. About a quarter of the texts are biblical manuscripts. Several are known apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, and the rest were previously unknown texts. These texts are in 3 languages. The earliest texts are in Aramaic. The biblical texts are in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. All of the Cave 7 manuscripts are in Greek, and so are a couple of the Cave 4 biblical manuscripts. Some of the texts are translations. There is an Aramaic translation of Job and the Aramaic original text, and a Hebrew translation of Tobit. The text of 1st Enoch in Aramaic without the similitudes of Jubilees in Hebrew, and the letter of Jeremiah and a partial text of 1st Enoch in Greek were found. All of these texts are pietistic, even mystical. No texts of known Essene opponents such as the Pharisees or the Hasmoneans or the Sadducees were found. And all of these texts are pre-Christian. So Christianity is never mentioned. The same texts in the same proportions were found in all of the caves. It is possible they were placed in the caves to hide them from the Romans, but they may have already been there. Josephus says there were 3 groups among the Jews: the Sadducees, who believed man had free will and did not believe in predetermination; the Pharisees, who believed that some things were predetermined and others were not, that man had a degree of free will; and the Essenes, who believed that everything was predetermined or predestined. However, even the Essenes believed that a person's decision to join the Essenes came from free will. It was not predetermined. The Essenes were also unique among Jews in that they believed in double predestination. Those belonging to their group who continued in their ways would be saved. All other Jews, including all those who left the group, and all Gentiles would be damned. The sect believed there were 2 ways for mankind. The spirit of the angel of light led the sons of light, the sectarian group, in the way of righteousness, and the spirit of the angel of darkness led the sons of darkness in the way of darkness, or the way of Belial, or Satan. They traced the origin of evil to the angelic watchers, the sons of God, who took human women in Genesis 6. The Essenes believed God had made the new covenant with them alone, and God gave them alone the Holy Spirit, and they alone were the true Israel. They lived like the tribes of Israel in the wilderness, ready to engage in holy war, with Qumran itself as a temple, but without animal sacrifice, although they did have sacred meals. They paid the temple tax, but to themselves. They were obsessed with purity and believed impurity could flow upward from an unclean vessel into a clean one. Lawrence Schiffman says this agrees with the Sadducean teaching. They renewed the covenant annually at Pentecost. They believed in a solar calendar of 364 days and a lunar one of 354 days, which was different from the calendar in use by other Jews. They believed they worshipped in fellowship with the angels. In other words, the angels were actually in their presence as they worshipped side by side with them. And they believed that they were living in the end of days. Only the teacher of righteousness, their founder, had the correct interpretation of Scripture and prophecy. There would be an eschatological war with the Romans and other Jews in which the angels would fight for the Essenes, for the sect. Then would appear two Messiahs, a priestly one from the tribe of from the tribe of Aaron, and a Davidic king from the tribe of Judah, who would slay the leader of their enemies, after which the dead would be raised. They opposed the Sadducees, and they also opposed the Pharisees, who they called the seekers after smooth things. And this is a pun on the Hebrew word halakha. The shoddy wall builders, with a lying Talmud, who sought the easy way. They called themselves the Way, the Many, the community of the New Covenant, the Sons of Light. They shared communal property, and this should sound familiar. They were led by a group of 12 men, 3 of whom were priests. They engaged in ritual immersion, which was ineffective for cleansing if the member's heart was not pure. They celebrated a communal meal with bread and wine, presided over by a priest, which anticipated the coming of the Messiah, at which one day the Davidic Messiah would be present. One text says the Messiah will be the Son of God. Another says God will beget the Messiah. One text says that heaven and earth will listen to the Messiah. He will liberate the captives, restore sight to the blind, and straighten the bent. He will heal the wounded, raise the dead, and bring good news to the poor. One scroll contains a list of blessings similar to the Sermon on the Mount. One man engaged in study of the Scriptures continually, and all of the members of the sect engaged in study 1/3 of every night of the year. Now I'm going to talk about the most important scrolls. The Great Isaiah Scroll contains the complete book of Isaiah. Although it is a paraphrastic text, its base is virtually identical with the Masoretic text. The Damascus document recounts the origin of the sect and gives rules for married Essenes living in towns. The community rule gives rules for adult celibate males living at Qumran. The temple scroll, although older than the community, speaks in the voice of God. In other words, it's a rewritten Torah, and it changes the noun from God said to I say. It speaks in the voice of God, and it amplifies the Mosaic regulations about the sanctuary in concentric circles of holiness. The commentary on Nahum recounts the acts of Alexander Jannaeus in persecuting the Pharisees. The copper scroll is a dry list of buried treasure, the treasure has not been found. It is inscribed on copper. 4QMMT is a letter from the sect or its leaders to some adversaries in Jerusalem listing works of the law that they wish their enemies to obey. The Aramaic Levi document is a text exalting Levi, which evidently became the basis of the pseudepigraphal book, The Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. The Habakkuk commentary discusses the Romans, the opponents of the teacher of righteousness, and says the righteous, the sect, will live by faith in the teacher of righteousness. They say that they will live by faith in the teacher of righteousness. It exhibits a style of interpreting prophecy through contemporary events similar to the style of interpreting prophecy in the New Testament. The Florilegium is a thematic commentary that says that God will build a sanctuary of men whose offering will be the works of the law. It also speaks about how the branch of David will save Israel, and how the branch of David will raise up the fallen tent of David. The Melchizedek text envisions Melchizedek as an angelic creature who will execute the final judgment. The thanksgiving hymns are songs of praise to God for his mercy and forgiveness to his sinful creatures of clay. In other words, the thanksgiving hymns indicate that the members of the sect believed their obedience to the law did not save them, but they relied on God's mercy for salvation instead. The Psalm scroll has the canonical psalms in a different order, plus 9 other texts and several non-canonical psalms, including Psalm 151 from the Septuagint in 2 versions, because the Septuagint version only has half the psalm, and 2 or 3 psalms that are preserved in Syriac versions. The Genesis Apocryphon is an Aramaic paraphrase and midrash on Genesis, which begins with the birth of Noah and continues through Genesis 15. The biblical texts in the scrolls attest variant readings found in the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch. In other words, they give the Hebrew version of these readings, as well as other variants. But the majority of the biblical scrolls follow the Masoretic text. All of the books of the Hebrew Bible were found except Esther and Nehemiah. Evidently, the group never accepted Esther as canonical. Since Ezra and Nehemiah are counted as one book in Hebrew, and part of Ezra was found, Nehemiah is assumed to have existed but been lost. Copies of Jubilees and First Enoch found were greater than the number of most biblical books. Several dialects of Hebrew are attested at Qumran, indicating at least a partial revival of the Hebrew language.